We will unmute you if you have a question. It's just that sometimes we get a lot of background noise, but we will get started. Good morning, everyone, and good evening to people that are joining us from India. And thank you for joining us today. I think today we're talking about a very important topic, especially in parenting. I mean, of course, I am worried about the terrible twos and threes and fours, but this phase, this teenage phase, which is so critical, or the preteen phase. So, we are very lucky today that we are having this session on helping teens thrive. Practical tips and strategies with Dr. Anisha Abraham, who is an MD and MPH. I mean, the whole accolades are there, and she is a global teen expert. But before we go on, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Sipping Thoughts. So I am Sukirti Gupta. I am the co-founder of Sipping Thoughts. Sipping Thoughts is a multi-platform media company that was co-founded by me and by Meeta Gurgutia. It was set up keeping in mind the tagline, Real Women, Real Thoughts. We wanted to create a no judgment platform and create a network of women for women, and of course, the men that have supported us. Sipping Thoughts reaches to about 2.5 million women on a monthly basis. But this, we are talking about the confusing teen years. And I am dreading them because from all I hear from my friends, this is a very difficult and awkward phase. And from when speaking with you, preteen, which starts from 10 and it goes now all the way till the age of 21. So in this session, we're going to have Dr. Anisha Abraham will provide us with a lot of practical strategies on how we can help teens handle stress and uncertainty, navigate social media and sexual health, build resilience, and discover their unique identity, and a lot more. Dr. Anisha, I mean, God, no, has such an amazing background. She's an MD, an MPH, she's a pediatrician, she's a teen health specialist, public health researcher, Tedx speaker, and she has just recently published a book called Raising Global Teens. She has been on CNN, NPR, NBC, The Voice of America, and the South China Morning Post. You can definitely reach out to her on her website. She has had so many roles, but she is currently based in Washington, D.C., is on the faculty of the Georgetown University Hospital and the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. So, Anisha, first of all, a very warm welcome to Sipping Thoughts. We're so excited to have you here.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be part of this.
So, Anisha, I'm going to just delve right in because I have so many questions. And I know I'll start off with some questions before we go into the main topic. But in COVID times, we are finding that we are having a tough time coping. So that we know that children, again, are having a lot tougher time than us. What are the main issues that you have seen that are cropping up for teens?
Yes, I agree. I want to first again thank you for allowing me to be part of this conversation, and certainly all of the folks that have joined today to be also part of this discussion. And I will say that the time of COVID has been really difficult for young people. Many of them are feeling isolated. They're feeling that they are not able to connect with friends and family members. They can't travel. They are missing milestones. They aren't able to have the usual routines, perhaps by attending school or even being in their extracurricular activities. And what I've seen is that many young people are also expressing that they're feeling more anxious, depressed, and stressed. So I think that the issue of mental health is becoming a significant one, not only in India, but throughout the world, certainly here in the United States. And I think this is something that we as parents, as caregivers, need to be really aware of. I would also probably say not only is there a mental health related issue, but also I'm seeing more young people that are becoming sedentary, and we're worried about issues related to being overweight and obese increasing because kids are just not getting out and doing the usual activities. So I think there's a lot that we need to be thinking about, and hopefully we'll be talking a little bit more about some strategies to support our children, our teenagers, because this is just a difficult time around the world.
Now, your next question, because your book is about the global team. Is there such a thing as a global team, and what is the global team?
Well, I believe that global teens are really another word for cross-cultural kids. And that is an umbrella term for young people that have had different backgrounds, but probably more than anything have been exposed to more than one culture on a daily basis. And I truly believe that more and more kids around the world have had that experience. So whether their parents are immigrants, they themselves are immigrants, they're moving from community to community within the same country. They are moving from country to country, as I've had the experience with my own kids. They had parents from different backgrounds, from different religious or cultural backgrounds. And in addition to that, not only having this exposure physically, but also now virtually. Many kids are on screens or on devices or on computers and are being exposed to more culture online. And so certainly that's something else to be thinking about. And I think there's some wonderful strengths that come along with being a cross-cultural kid. For example, adaptability and a worldview and languages. These are all really wonderful qualities to have, but there also can be some challenges. That can include if you're moving from place to place. And again, we've just moved very recently from the Netherlands back to the United States, where there can be a sense of grief and loss of you losing that community that you've had before. There certainly has been some thought that adolescence can be more delayed or prolonged because you're not seeing just one culture, but multiple cultures. So it's sometimes hard to know how to experiment and try and do things when there's so many different inputs that are going on. And so there's probably the final thought that young people express to me is that one related to identity and belonging, not quite knowing sometimes where they truly connect and who their tribe is. And we can talk about that more, but these are all really important issues to think about with kids that are cross-cultural, have had more than one culture in their daily life.
So, you are a pediatrician, of course, you have a lot of expertise, but what motivated you to really write this book? And you've used a lot of personal vignettes that are interspersed throughout. You indicate that you too struggled with many of the issues that you discuss in the book. So, talk to us about some of those experiences and how it relates to the book and how it relates to you, and what was some of the toughest things that you experienced while growing up?
Well, I grew up as the daughter of South Asian immigrants to the United States. My parents came from Kerala, and I was born in Delaware. And at the time when I was growing up, if you saw another South Asian, another Indian, you literally stopped your car to say hello. There were so few Indians at the time. And I was the first Indian American to graduate from my high school. There just weren't many other people that looked like me. I was surrounded by other people that, didn't have dark skin or didn't have, dark curly hair at the time. And so, until I went into university and I saw other Indian Americans, I didn't quite have the sense of these are my people, my tribe, my connection. And so that time period of adolescence where you're trying to, again, develop your own unique cultural identity in addition to your physical and gender and sexual identity was also just a little bit more difficult. So I think that partly informed my own interest in writing this book. As I mentioned, I've also moved from country to country with my own family, with my two boys that are currently 10 and 12. And we moved to the United States, initially to Hong Kong, where we lived for 5 years, and then to the Netherlands. And certainly there was a lot that we experienced in moving from culture to culture, and that I kind of thought of as a parent. And I've also taken care of young people in cross-cultural settings. I'm a military physician. I was a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. I've worked with young people that have moved from community to community, certainly have also worked in different countries with young people that are cross-cultural. So as a physician, I also really think about all of these issues. And that was part, again, of the reason why I decided to write a book that really thought of all of the hot issues that young people are struggling with, whether it's stress or mental health or sexual health, or thinking about the future, but with that lens of having that cross-cultural perspective, which I think is so important. And again, we're seeing more and more young people that are having that experience.
Two of the issues that you focus a lot on, one is, of course, on body image and, of course, about sexual education. Do you want to say a little bit about that before we delve further?
Absolutely. I mean, I could spend the entire hour just talking about those issues, but I will
That's a big one, especially for girls, boys, everybody now, this body image issue.
Right. Well, I will just say that it doesn't matter. It didn't matter which country I was in. The issues related to body image, for example, are ones that are pervasive. And certainly there's a lot of reasons for that, but exposure to media is one, but also now peers, certainly also sometimes the messages that they're getting from their own parents. So it's something that's very pervasive. And what I think is really important, probably my quick thought when it relates to body image, is that body image is very much linked to self-esteem and one's own feeling in terms of their body and self-confidence. And so it's so important for young people that are not feeling good about themselves to be able to change the perception of feeling good about what's on the outside to feeling good about what's on the inside. And that is something that starts really early. The average girl, at least in the United States, starts dieting by the time that they're 9 or 10 years of age. So these messages are coming really early. So it's important for us as parents to be attuned to what kids are feeling in terms of their bodies, not just girls, but also boys, and making sure that we're really on top of what they're telling us and how we can start to, again, make that switch and make them feel good about what's going on inside. And being also knowledgeable about getting them to get extra help if these issues are starting to occur in terms of them not feeling good about themselves. That's the body image piece. The sexual health piece, while I lived in the Netherlands, that is the gold standard when it comes to sexual education. I learned a lot, even as an educator and as a parent, from what the Dutch did in terms of starting sexual education at very young ages. By the time kids are 4 or 5, it's mandatory in schools. Of course, it's developmentally appropriate, but there's a very open culture of talking about body and what the changes that are going on, the importance of consent. So what we do know is that the data is so wonderful then when it relates to Dutch youth in terms of having low rates of things like teen pregnancy, but also high rates of feeling good about themselves and having a positive relationship. Those are things that we don't always talk about. So I can come back to the point that parents don't always feel comfortable. In fact, most teenagers tell me that they haven't talked to their parents about sexual health. I can certainly say that if we have a group of people that are South Asian, most of them will say, no, I've definitely not done that. This is really awkward to talk to my kids about. So I talk a lot in my book about some very specific steps, at what age you need to be talking about what, and more importantly, that we should be having these discussions. If we as parents don't, then our kids are going to go to the internet or to friends or other sources for information. And if we don't feel comfortable, use the global village. Get someone that feels comfortable, whether it's that aunt or uncle or an educator, or even sometimes your physician. But it's so important that we give them good information and we start these conversations early.
But Anisha, that's so interesting to hear because we thought that this is mainly an Indian problem because we're sitting here. Maybe we are much more narrow minded. But to see that this is a global issue that everybody, or I would say parents everywhere, are struggling with this very, very important conversation of sexual health that we need to have with our children. Now, of course, the last question I'm going to ask you is what do you want parents to take away from the session today?
Well, I would say probably the most important concept that I'd like parents to take away, which is something that I also talk about quite a bit in my book, is the importance of conversations with teenagers right now. And conversations build connections, and connections are really protective, particularly in a time of pandemic when young people are not feeling good about themselves, are feeling isolated or feeling down. And we'll talk more about some specific tips in terms of making those connections and having those conversations. But I do hope that any parent that's on this conversation today will think about one thing that they can bring back to their home to start having that discussion with their teenager or child about an important issue.
And also, please, everyone, please do keep chatting with us. Please keep sending us your questions. We want to hear from you, and we want to make sure that Dr. Anisha is able to cover that all. And Anisha, over to you. Thank you.
So I'm going to just share a few tips that I think are very important. I've called them 7 practical tips in keeping with being focused and certainly with our time that I think are really important for young people today in terms of supporting them and helping them to thrive. And these are the tips that I'll be talking about. The first is making communication effective. We just talked about, again, how important it is to have conversations. We'll be talking about what are some of the best ways to ensure that you do have those conversations with young people, knowing that adolescence can be a really tough time. I'm going to talk a bit more about unique strengths. We talked briefly about the fact that body image is a huge concern among young people. So being able to make that switch and to get young people to think about what's inside, but also their unique strengths is a very important thing that we can consider when working with teenagers. The other issue that I'll be talking about is screen time. This is one that I get a lot of questions. I mean, raise your hand. How many of you are struggling at home right now when it comes to young people and screen time and figuring out, what is the balance? And so I'm going to, again, give some specific tips in terms of how to support that. We talked about mental health as being an issue among young people currently with the pandemic. It certainly is an issue in general. So I'm going to talk a bit about the importance of creating what I call an anti-stress toolkit, and also the importance of staying attuned to warning signs and knowing what those warning signs are. Identity and belonging is a very important issue, one that's dear to my heart as someone that works with cross-cultural kids. So we'll talk just a little bit about that. And finally, I'm going to end by talking about something very positive, which is how do we get our kids to build resilience, to have what I call the concept of having bounce, and being able to problem solve on their own. So talking a little bit about communication, I will just say that, again, conversations are so important right now, but it can be sometimes tough when you're working with a teenager, because sometimes they tend to pull away. They want to speak to their friends alone. They're on their computers or in their rooms. And so these are my 3 very specific quick tips when it comes to talking to young people and having effective communication. The first is that if you're working with a young person, and certainly as a pediatrician, I do this all the time, if I want to bring up a difficult topic, for example, are other kids vaping or smoking, which seems to be a big issue among young people right now, but you're not quite sure how to bring up that topic, ask about what their friends are doing, because what their friends are doing will certainly affect what they are doing. So again, do you know any other kids at school that are vaping right now? Do you know any kids right now that are feeling stressed or depressed or feeling not very good about themselves? And that is a great segue to talk about what's happening in their lives. In addition to talking about friends, my other tip is that sometimes it can be really intimidating when you're talking to a young person and you're looking them directly in their eyes. And you can just think about your own parent, and when they're looking you straight in the eyes, that can be really tough. So my other tip is try to do things in parallel. So whether you're walking with them, you are driving them somewhere, you are late at night, and this is what I sometimes do with my own boys, and you're in their rooms and the lights are kind of dark or down a little bit and they're a little bit sleepy, but you're not looking them straight in the eyes because again, it's, the lights are dim. Those are good times to have those conversations and to start again talking about some of these difficult things. And my final tip when it comes to communication, and again, there's a lot more we can talk about, is the one that I call the 50% rule. And I am certainly guilty as a parent. My kids tell me this quite often, of going on and on. My kids say, Mom, sometimes you just keep, talking on, and it's hard to kind of know, what you're trying to say. And we forget that kids' prefrontal cortex is not completely developed. And in fact, the teen brain is not fully developed until someone is about in their early 20s. And sometimes they look fully adult by the time that they're 17 or 18. But again, the brain is not fully developed until you're in your early 20s. And so it's important to realize that even though we have very long logical arguments, our kids usually have stopped listening to us after the first sentence or two. So again, coming back to my 50% rule, say half of what you would like to say to have more effective communication. Try to keep it short and simple. You're more likely to get your teenagers and your children to actually listen. My next quick tip has to do with related to strengths and creativity. And I say that all children, all teenagers are uneven. That means that they excel in some areas, and certainly we as adults are the same way. We excel in some areas, but we maybe have some challenges in others. And a lot of, again, what I work with as a pediatrician, working with teenagers, is this concept of building on their unique strengths. And everyone has something that they, again, excel in, whether it's the arts or music. One of my boys loves technology, and he started during the COVID pandemic to create his own YouTube videos where he builds things and he actually narrates it and then uploads that onto a YouTube channel as a way to talk about technology and his love for technology and to get other young kids to start to build different projects. So whatever your child likes doing, whether it's debate team or dancing or any of these things, build on those strengths. These are important things to come back to when they're not feeling so good about themselves. Now, this, of course, comes back to that big question that many parents have about technology. And I know I've asked all of you whether or not you're struggling with this at home. I suspect if we were together, most of you would be nodding your head saying, oh, yes, this is a problem. And the question I get is, how much time is too much time? How much time should we be telling our kids to be on technology in general? And my short answer is that screen time and devices actually have some positive value. As a pediatrician, I think it actually can be very beneficial in terms of certainly education, but also connections. Teenagers tell me over and over again that right now it's an important way for them to connect with their family and friends. So don't be completely dismissive of the fact that technology, again, can be very positive and supportive for young people. I will also say that there are some times where we need to also think about limits and balance. And so my recommendation when it comes to technology is what I call the 3 Cs. The first is we as parents are going to be coaches. We are media coaches. We are going to be helping them to decide what's right and wrong. And the first C stands for what I call context. The next C is community. And the third C has to do with your child. So when it comes to context, know what your child is doing on their devices or on their screens, for example. I, for example, have a lot of tolerance for Khan Academy. I think it's a wonderful platform. There's a lot that kids can learn from it. If my son wants to be on that for a few hours, I probably would be okay with it. If he happened to be on a very mindless, violent video game, I would probably have a lower threshold in terms of getting him to not be on it for so long and giving some limits. So know the context of what he's engaging. Secondly, know your child. I have 2 boys, and one of them can get off technology with probably a reminder. The other one sometimes takes a little bit longer to disengage. And you probably in your own family know that you have children that have differences. Certainly in many of the teenagers I work with, there can be differences. And some kids have a really, really hard time getting off. This can be sometimes like a drug. It's so hard for them to disengage. So if you have a child that has a hard time getting off of a device, is waking up in the middle of the night on their device, is lying about their use, those are reasons that you really sometimes will need to put in limits. Common Sense Media is a wonderful resource that creates a media contract. There are lots of other sources where you can create a media contract you can write out with your child. But remember, at the end of the day, you as a parent or an adult probably are paying for your child's phone or device, and you have the power to take it out of their room at nighttime, to stop it for periods of time, to encourage that there are some limits. And if you can't do it by yourself, certainly getting help in terms of a professional to help you. And then the final piece is knowing what we call the community, and knowing that if a child is no longer engaging in the broader community, is only on their device, is always, for example, playing video games, that there may be some issues. And we don't call it anymore internet addiction, but we call it problematic interactive media use. And so if your child, again, is on media to the point where they're not sleeping properly, they're not eating properly, they're not engaging, you may have a child that needs some extra help and support. You, again, as a parent, are the one that's going to need to limit it, but you may need to get some extra help.
And if you have a couple of questions here, because now that school has shifted, and literally school is online these days for almost all the kids. So they're already spending so much time on technology. How does one deal with that? And then after that, their socialization is also on technology.
Right. And as I mentioned, we are going to need to realize that technology has its benefits, and probably also decrease our expectations in terms of how much time we think kids are going to need to be on technology. So I think we're going to need to relax our standards just a little bit, knowing that young people need to be on their computers and devices much more if they are online right now for school. So that would be the one thing, even in my own home, but certainly as a pediatrician, I'll say this is an unusual time. So our kids are going to need to be on devices just a little bit longer. Having said that, I still think it's really important to make sure that we have what I call non-digital time, and we have time for breaks. In my own household, I really make sure that at least every day for probably a good 45 minutes to an hour, that all devices are out and that they're outdoors doing something physical, or even indoors doing something physical, but we're off devices. And we as parents need to model that. The same goes for meal times. I try as much as possible at dinner time to make sure we have no devices, including, again, myself and my husband, because that gives, again, kids the understanding that mealtime is a time where we're talking to each other and we're not just checking things and looking at scores or watching something else for entertainment. So that would be my quick thought in terms of how we navigate this really challenging time. But in general, our kids are going to be on devices more, and they do need it for connections. So I think we need to understand that, and again, play that role of a coach. Not someone that's going to give strict hours, and no such thing as just being on computers anymore for just 2 or 3 hours, for example, but being a coach, understanding, talking to them, I think is helpful.
There's a question that's come in from Nita. So I think it's the right time to take it. How do you set a limit for kids who do not agree to the limit?
Well, this is where I come back to the fact that you are the parent and you are the one that's in charge. And you also are the one that probably is paying for those devices. And so being able to work, and I think that media contracts, again, are something that you can fill out with your child that actually creates guidelines, and it's something that you sign, and there are consequences if they are not sticking to those guidelines and sticking to those limitations. So you as a parent need to create those limits and ensure that your kids realize that there might be some consequences. And sometimes also the way to think about it is to frame it in a positive way. If we work towards this, this is something positive that will come out of it, not something that's negative. Kids tend to do better when there are positive as opposed to negative consequences. As I mentioned, if you feel like you can't do that, I would certainly consider getting help from, again, a professional, whether it's a psychologist, a counselor, a physician, if, again, you're not able to provide those boundaries or work with your kid in terms of setting it up. And these things can be really challenging right now. I can probably imagine you're at home going, well, it's great to have these contracts and great to do these things, but just be at home with my child when you can't, you tell them to turn off a device. And I certainly have been there as a parent. But I, again, want to empower all of you to say, you do have the right to move those devices out, to tell them that they can't have it at nighttime, to make sure they're charging it somewhere else. So thinking about that is one step in terms of ensuring these things happen.
So I think a follow-up from her, which is very interesting because I'm just taking it because I think a lot of parents will have this question. If you set, let's suppose, limits, they rebel to that too. And if you set consequences, they rebel to that because they're in that very rebellious stage at this point.
Well, what I talk about in my book is this whole idea of starting to have what we call autonomous supportive conversations. And that media use is one of those areas where over time, we are getting them to become independent in their use and to be kind of good, have good judgment. But as I mentioned, for some kids, this can be just a little bit more challenging and certainly can be also very developmental. So I think you need to know your own child and understand, is this someone that has a hard time getting off of the device, is only spending time on their device, and they're actually not having that balance that they need to have? Or is it someone that is getting some educational benefit from it, is doing okay with it, in which case maybe you don't need to be pushing so hard for them to get off right now? Again, is it a young person that is on their devices, is doing some of these things where they're staying in contact with friends, but also is getting some non-digital time every day? So every child is different. You as a parent know them. If you feel that there's tremendous amount of rebellion, then you need to kind of step back and say, why is that going on? Is this a child that is getting all of their stimulation right now from the computer to the point where there is no balance? Or is it, there's some other reason? So going back, talking to them, understanding why there is that pushback, trying to get them to understand why balance is so important right now. And like I said, reaching out and getting some help from the global village may be other ways to approach it. So hopefully I've answered that just a little bit more. But again, it's not a one size fits all response. I think every child is going to be different in terms of why they're rebelling and pushing back.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. We can
So
move
I'm just going to
move
continue
forward.
on if
Yeah.
there's no other questions.
They'll keep coming, but we'll take a lot at the end also.
So hopefully I've answered that question. Again, we can come back to the whole idea of how do you help young people when they are rebelling and they are pushing back, because it isn't an easy issue. But I will talk a little bit more about some of these other tips, and maybe we can talk more in the Q&A about that particular issue. As I mentioned, and certainly as we know, young people are really struggling right now with issues related to mental health. And I'm a firm believer in what I call creating an anti-stress toolkit, and ensuring that young people know what things that they can go to when they're feeling really down or really upset. So whether that's doing something together as a family. I believe family meal times, rituals are really important, whether that's mindfulness, yoga, exercise, listening to music, talking to a friend, whatever it is, they need to start to build that. But we as adults need to model that behavior as well. And I know a lot of adults are feeling very stressed out, trying to balance this, have kids at home, trying to figure out how to handle the rebellion, handle all of the issues that are coming up from them. And as I say, when you're on a plane, you need to put your oxygen mask on first as a parent before you help the child. So we as adults also need to make sure we are doing things to handle our own stress before we help our own kids. In addition to, of course, modeling these coping skills, I would also say this is a wonderful time to model kindness. So whether that's getting out and volunteering in the community, supporting others, treating others as we would treat ourselves, regardless of background. I can certainly say in the United States, this is a really polarizing time. So again, those messages of kindness are some things I think are really important for our kids to see from us as parents, and certainly to emulate into the broader community. The next piece that I would also add is that we need to be attuned to warning signs. And I think it's very important for parents to be aware that it can be hard when you're a teenager to know always what's going on. A lot of parents say, my child, one moment they're happy and they're laughing, and the next moment they're crying, they're irritable, they're angry, they're screaming at me. It just goes, one emotion to the other. And that is part of adolescence. That has to do with hormones and all of the other changes that are going on with their brain development. So it can be a little bit sometimes challenging to really know when there might be a true issue. But I will say that if you have a child, for example, that's sleeping a lot more than usual, not eating normally, is talking about feeling constantly sad or down, ever references dying or not wanting to be around or is giving away possessions, that is definitely a red flag. So I think it's so important for us as parents to check in on a regular basis, ask our teenagers and children how they're feeling about the situation, and ask specifically about depression and suicide. Many parents think if they ask about these issues, they're more likely to increase young people becoming suicidal or depressed. And actually, the converse is true. They're more likely to get the help and support that they need. And even if they don't tell you on that particular time, you've planted the seed for them to come back to you to talk about issues when they do occur. So I just, again, want to reiterate the importance of being aware of these warning signs, but also asking very specifically, because you're more likely to, again, get young people the help that they need. Most kids aren't going to tell you, Mom, I'm depressed, or Mom, I'm suicidal. They certainly don't always say that when they come into the pediatrician, but by asking, we're likely to get that support and help that they really do need. We talked at the beginning of our conversation about identity and belonging. I told you that part of the reason I wrote the book, Raising Global Teens, has to do with the fact that so many young people are now in a multicultural, cross-cultural environment, are being exposed to more than one culture on a daily basis. And that this issue of knowing who you're connected to, what your roots are, and certainly knowing who your tribe is and where you belong are really big issues among young people. In writing the book, I also did a survey of about 350 teenagers around the world. And what was interesting is that most young people that were cross-cultural told me that no parent had ever asked them, or at least 70% told me that no parent ever had a conversation about identity and belonging with them. So these are, again, important things for us to talk about, even though we sometimes assume that everything is going well. And so certainly asking how they're feeling about themselves, about their background, all of those other issues, I think are really important. Ensuring that, again, they have connections in the community that they're in, ensuring that you're taking time for them to think about their heritage, their background, their belonging, taking time for them to make sure that you value language, whatever your home language is. And I know in India, this is something that young kids are doing quite well in. They're able to speak sometimes multiple languages, but this is, again, a topic that I think is so important, and having that conversation is really, again, essential for teenagers. And my final point, before we go back into some Q&A, and I know that you have lots of questions, is this concept of what I call developing resilience. I call it having bounce. And I say that probably the most important predictor of success, and I know that this is something that Indian parents very much value, is this idea of ensuring that our kids are successful and they do well. But the most important predictor of success as an adult is not having a perfect CV or perfect grades, or even getting into the top university, or even getting, again, a top job. But in fact, it's being able to get back up on your feet after you've experienced a challenge, a disappointment, a failure. And this is a very important concept because I've had young people that have come to university campuses when I've worked at Georgetown that have done very well. They've had excellent grades. They're well-rounded, and they get their first bad grade, their first relationship issue, and they fall apart because they're so used to being in a situation where other people are helping them sometimes to move away obstacles, to move away challenges, and they haven't been able to handle these things on their own. So allowing kids to problem solve, allowing them to experience some discomfort and challenge, which I know is hard, and I can certainly say as an Asian mother, this is something that I'm also guilty of. We want to make things easy because we want our kids to do well. But again, allowing them to make those experience those challenges at home before they go off is so important. And again, this whole idea of allowing them over time to have what I call intrinsic motivation as opposed to extrinsic motivation is also really important. Allowing them to want to be the ones that are in the driver's seat and have that passion and drive. So as much as we can think about this idea of having bounce, the pandemic is a really important time where kids are really being sometimes challenged. This is a wonderful opportunity, again, to build this idea of resilience. Kids are not born with resilience, but we can certainly help them to build and cultivate it. So that's my final point in terms of getting kids to thrive. And I will end here. And I'll just summarize again. It's this whole idea of talking to kids and having effective communication, building strengths, thinking about media use and that balance, having a toolkit that we talked about in terms of self-coping skills, certainly talking about issues related to warning signs, identity and belonging, and of course, as I mentioned at the very end, this idea of having bounce. And for those of you that don't do as well with pictures but need words, here's a quick summary as well of some of the 7 tips that I've just relayed. And again, we'll go back to all of your wonderful questions. Thank you for allowing me to share that. So I'll stop there.
I'm going to start with a question, but I know there are lots coming. I know one of the biggest questions as parents that we have is how much to push and how much to stand back. I mean, do you see your child and you see there's so much potential, but you're always, especially now, you don't want to be labeled as the tiger mom, the X mom, the Y mom. There's so many labels, but you also see that if you're not doing anything, are you not making them reach their full potential? So what are your thoughts on that? And then Varsha, we'll take your question next.
So to come back to this point of how much should we push and how much should we not, I think it's a really important question. And certainly I will say that there can be a cultural component to this. And having lived in Hong Kong and then having lived in the Netherlands, I can say that, there can be real differences in terms of how sometimes parents can be. I learned a lot, by the way, about parenting living in the Netherlands, and the Dutch are considered some of the happiest kids in the world. And I remember when I first moved there, I said, is there any tutorial? I really want to make sure I get a math tutor for my child. And they said, you're in the Netherlands, we don't do tutoring here, but we do make sure that kids get out and they're on their bikes and they're out playing sports. And Wednesday in the Netherlands was a half day for all kids, so they could just have some downtime. And all schools started 1 hour later on Fridays, so kids can sleep in. And I just thought, wow, what an interesting place, a community where we allow kids to be kids and to have some downtime and to be a little bit more relaxed, to get out and to do some other things. And again, for parents not always to kind of be on top of them. And I do think a lot of Dutch parenting is allowing kids to become independent over time, allowing them to be autonomous and independent and to make good decisions. So I just say that. I know that's hard because so much of what we also see in our own community, and I've lived in Hong Kong where, again, there's a very different standard and norm, but I just want to impart a little bit of that Dutch parenting to all of us, because at the end of the day, we do want our kids to be happy. We do want them to be balanced. We do want them to be kind of doing well in life. And I would probably say that this concept of what I call dolphin parenting is probably one to aspire to. Dolphins are very social animals, but they go with the flow just a little bit more, as opposed to tiger parents or some of these other types of parents. So if we can try to sometimes stand back and not remove obstacles or problems or challenges, allow our kids to experience a little bit more of them, allow them to problem solve. We can work with them on brainstorming how to handle challenges, but not jumping in and doing it for them. I think that is a better way for us to think about. general. So hopefully that answers just a little bit of what you're asking, but I think it's this concept of starting to give them some autonomy early on, even though we always worry about whether or not they're going to do well. And you know your child, every child has a different temperament. Some are going to need a little bit more support than others, but not all kids need us to constantly remind them and tell them and be on top of them.
Varsha, go ahead. Your question.
I'm glad to talk to you. Like, I've got an opportunity to talk to you. My question is that my daughter is in 8th standard and she's not at all serious about her studies, and I have to deal with her. And I don't know how to deal with her because whenever I try to explain her about the studies, she gets very aggressive. She have got lots many various things just to come out of the stress. She just want to skip the studies because now the schools are going online. So she is not attending her class fairly. That's the thing. So I'm not understanding how to make her study and how to make her explain that the studies are important at this age.
Just remind me how old your daughter is, by the way. I know she's in 8th standard, but how old is she?
She's 13 years old.
13. So I really sympathize with your situation, and I'm sure there are probably other parents right now on this call that are also in the same place. It is not easy right now for many young people that are online to stay focused. I will also say that my own boys, we moved from country to country, and they are now online in a new school and in a new country. And one of my sons in particular has really struggled with staying motivated and staying engaged. The other child, by the way, is doing really well and really loves being online. So my point being that for some kids, particularly at the age of 13 and 14, just the concept of being online can be really challenging for them. They may not like the experience. They really would prefer to see their friends. They don't feel motivated. Their teachers may not be very engaging. The teachers themselves may not be doing so well with the technology. So there's a lot of reasons why kids may not be motivated. And I think that's one thing to be aware of. Certainly for some young kids also, this idea of the pandemic is really tough, as we talked about. They're losing that routine. They're feeling isolated. There may be some issues in terms of also just feeling a little bit more stressed or down related to what's happening. So I just want to again mention that because I think a lot of young people are feeling that, and it's really hard again at this age to stay motivated. Now, certainly if you have a child that's 13, they're also trying to pull away from their parent. They don't want their mom or dad always on top of them. A very important part of adolescence is this process of being their own individual and spending more time with peers. So understanding that, knowing that they're probably very moody and they're probably sometimes, maybe talking back a bit more because they're trying to express their individuality and becoming their own kind of autonomous adult over time. So I would probably say that this is a time for you to maybe stand back just a little bit to realize that this is, again, challenging for many young people. I would also ask if it's related specifically to the online experience. I would certainly also ask how they're doing in terms of their emotional health and if they're actually feeling good about what's happening. And then I would try to see if I could flip it a little bit more. I think, yes, we're worried about kids not doing well in their studies, but as I mentioned, I also worry more about how kids are doing in terms of their own self-esteem. And so coming back to those strengths and the things that they're passionate about is really important right now, because that is the way to make them feel good about themselves. And again, over time, to get them back into their studies. So I don't know if your daughter enjoys something else. Does she like the arts? Does she like science? What else is she passionate about?
Right now, she just likes to be online. She's
Uh-huh.
just addicted to the social media, and it's very hard for me to deal with it. And like she's going very lazy in this pandemic. The routine is disturbed, and I don't know like how to deal about it. Like you told me that to stand back. Yes, I will do that surely, ma'am. It will help me. I hope so.
Well, what I would encourage you to think about is what is it that she really does enjoy? And I hear you when you say she likes to be on social media, but I suspect there's something else that she still connects with. And, you know, every child has that. One of my kids loves Legos, and that's his thing that he goes to. And then the other thing is that he loves animals. So we're spending a lot of time with neighbors, pets, and animals right now, because for him, that is the highlight of the day, being able to have that experience. So I think you need to go back to what is it that she really does enjoy that builds that self-esteem, and continue to make sure that she's doing that right now, probably as a break from the social media, but as a way to get her through this time, because that I think will be very useful. And the final thing is, if you're still really struggling and you don't feel like you're making a connection, you are worried that she's not doing so well, this may be a time that you can talk to someone else. Most professionals right now are doing telemedicine, so you don't actually have to go in to an office. But this may be a time just to get someone else's objective advice as to, you know, what might be happening. She may just be a normal adolescent like lots of other teenagers, but if you're worried you're not getting through, engaging that larger global village and getting some support might be really helpful. So good luck. I truly understand this is not easy, and I wish you the very best.
The next question we'll take from Swati. Swati, go ahead.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Thank you for giving this opportunity to attend this session. I really feel privileged. My question was, how feasible is it, or how advisable is it to give a personal mobile phone to kids aged 13 or earlier, or 13, 14? Because my daughter, she's insisting on having her personal mobile, and I am strictly not for it. Can you just suggest?
Absolutely. I'm smiling because we've gone through a similar situation at home, and I certainly have parents that ask me this all the time. And in my media chapter, I say that as much as you can delay these things, it's probably better, because again, the teen brain is not fully developed until sometime in their 20s. And when you give a child a phone, particularly the smartphone that has all the bells and whistles and has lots and lots of options to get onto YouTube and to send messages, kids are not always thinking about what they may be sending out. And certainly sometimes there can be some issues related to impulse control and whatever else. So coming back to your question, I think the real issue is, what are other kids doing? Is most of her classmates currently having a phone? Is that a primary means of social communication for her? Does she need this? And sometimes parents give kids phones because they may be commuting, they may be going to something where they actually need to check in with them. I suspect during the pandemic, we're doing a little bit less of that, but does she need that because you don't know where she is, or you need to check in at some interval, and it's important for safety and for that communication? So those would be things to ask. Certainly also, do you know your own child? Is she someone that's responsible with the phone? Is she someone that would work with you if you were to create a contract? Is she someone that would be constantly on social media checking, Instagram or Snapchat or whatever, and potentially not feeling so good about herself? Does she have that balance? So those are some of the questions that I would ask. And at the end of the day, it's a very personal decision. My own son wrote my husband and I a 5-page memo about why he felt at the age of 12 and a half that he needed a phone. Again, all of his peers at the time were getting it, but he quoted data and research and whatever else. So we finally caved in. But again, my real recommendation is, as much as you can delay, it really is helpful. If you can give them a boring flip phone, it's probably better. And certainly if you do give them a phone that has a lot more of those apps and whatever else, then you really need to also have those conversations about those limits. And you need to be talking to a 13-year-old, for example, about sexting, which is sending sexual images of themselves. You need to talk to them about pornography. A lot of boys, much less girls, are on screens right now and are viewing pornography. So, having these conversations, which again are not easy, are important when we give kids devices and we're not always checking. So hopefully that helps. I have a lot more tips in my media section. My shorter answer is, ask them what's going on, the reasons why, and also think about creating those contracts and so on. Good luck.
So the next question we'll take from Neeta. Neeta, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for this. And it's a very interesting session. And as you're going on sharing your experience, a lot of new questions start. Okay, so I just wanted to ask you, it's like, as a parent, I'm also going through hormonal changes, and she's also going through hormonal changes at the same point in time, right? You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. So, what after hearing you, it just comes to me that we are so obsessed about our own kids. Rather than focusing on ourselves, we are focusing more on them, correcting and giving them the direction. I'm not sure how much parents are focused and have reached to their own goals. Just a thought that just pops up into my head. So I feel parents, as a parent of a teen, I feel I'm very obsessed about my kids than about my own goals. So maybe we need to change our course. Just a thought, thought of asking you onto it. So how parents are responsible for the good or the bad the kid is choosing, uh, as we are just supposed to guide them. We're not always going to be right on that side.
So I think your question is, what is the balance? But also what effect sometimes does our own experiences, and certainly I think you alluded to the fact that sometimes we as women are going through hormonal changes, we may be going through early menopause, and we may be dealing with our own set of issues. And so how does that also affect? Is that your question?
And the second part, that we're obsessed with our kids, so we put ourselves second.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to take your the
Yeah,
first
yeah.
comment first, because I certainly also really understand it. And I sometimes tell my own kids, you're going through adolescence and mommy's going through mommy adolescence too. So don't minimize the fact that for some women, that the changes that you go through hormonally can also cause you to feel really irritable, can affect your sleep, have hot flashes. So being aware of that, and again, coming back to taking time for yourself, because you may not have the patience to respond to your own child and all of the things that are happening. And being aware and talking to other parents has been very helpful to me. So not to minimize for some women that are going through that experience what they're feeling, because it does, again, as I mentioned, decrease their level, their threshold for patience for all of these things. But I think the other question again is what to do when we're feeling too focused on our kids, and how to, is that right? How to create that balance. And I think again that at the end of the day, even though we want our kids to do well, and we feel that we're putting all this time into their education and their extracurriculars and ensuring that they go off to top places, I also think that it's important to realize that too much focus on all of these things may also be to their detriment. Because again, sometimes, as I mentioned, this hyper focus also doesn't allow them to become independent, to make autonomous decisions, for them to problem solve, and certainly in some situations can increase their own stress, the pressure that they put upon themselves. And how do we try to, again, navigate that? I think it's a lot of what I talked about before, which is taking care of ourselves first, making sure that we are handling our own stress, certainly that we are feeling balanced, because we do better as a parent when we're taking care of our kids in that situation. Making sure that we are having conversations with our partners, engaging the global village can be very helpful. Asking other parents. I'm a huge believer of, parent support groups, teen support groups, talking to other parents about what their experiences are, because that sharing in that community can be very helpful for us, and realizing we don't need to be so hyper-focused. Again, taking a cue from the Dutch about the importance of just allowing kids to have some downtime and some chill time as a very important part of them, allowing them to have play and being able to relax is also useful. So I would say trying not to be hyper-focused is probably something that we all as parents need to be thinking about, because ultimately our kids are going to do better. I hope that answers your question just a little bit, but thank you for bringing up all those valuable points.
So Gayatri had a question. She wanted to know more about body image issues and how to deal with that.
Well, I think that the whole issue related to body image and eating disorders is a very important one, and certainly one that is also in the Indian context. It's not just something that you see only in certain communities, but it's certainly around the world. And we're seeing increased young people in the South Asian Indian community that are having a low body image, not feeling good about themselves, much less anorexia, bulimia, binging, some of the other things that we think of under the umbrella of body image and eating disturbances. And so being aware of that, I think, is really important. Certainly the question that I ask young people when I see them as a pediatrician is, when you look at yourself in the mirror, what do you see? And are you happy with that? And I have young people that will say, Dr. Abraham, I have a big nose, but everybody else in my family has a big nose. So I'm okay with that. But I also have teenagers that come in and I ask them that question and no one's ever asked them that before. And they say, Dr. Abraham, I think I'm really ugly. Or I think I'm really, really fat. Or I'm really unhappy with what I see. And so I tell teenagers, it's okay sometimes to have a bad hair day, to not feel good about yourself. That's part of being a teenager. But if you're on a regular basis, not feeling good about yourself, that is something that we need to check and to change. And so being attuned to this early on, they may not be doing anything else except not feeling good about themselves. And so asking kids about this, being aware of that and making sure that we switch to thinking about the inside and all those strengths is one piece of it. Certainly if you have a child that for any reason is restricting their intake, is hyper exercising, has suddenly become a vegan or vegetarian. And I certainly know in India, there's plenty of vegetarians and vegans, but if they suddenly make that switch, we sometimes think of that also as a way to become restrictive in their eating. These are just little tip-offs. If they're starting to use a lot of steroids, they're becoming very obsessive as boys about, pumping weights. They want to take all these protein shakes. They're getting magazines or looking at images where, again, they're constantly seeing something that may not be attainable. This also can affect their body image. So being on top of that, asking about their friends and the pressure their friends are putting on their image and their bodies, and certainly what they're doing, are all good ways to understand. Asking and of course getting them help and support early on would be my other quick tips when it comes to body image. And my final point, and then we'll move on, is that many kids are on social media, for example, Instagram or some of these other forms of social media. And in general, I think there's nothing wrong with it. However, for some kids, they may be constantly checking social media and comparing themselves to others. And for those kids that are constantly checking and are constantly comparing and are not feeling good about themselves, they're at higher risk. In fact, 2 times at higher risk for an eating disorder or body image. So again, knowing your child, knowing what they're posting, what they're seeing, if they're making comments, and maybe sometimes limiting those forms of social media may also be really important because a lot of what they're thinking about themselves also comes from what they're seeing around others and that idea of comparison. So those are just some quick ideas in terms of body image.
Thank you. We'll take the next one from Dr. Shusmita. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Anisha. My question is, how important is mother tongue? Because I was actually reminded about this question because when you mentioned about the Dutch, actually my sister was in Amsterdam for Amstelveen for 3 years, and she always told me the teachers there. My nephews were around 5 years, 4 years, 6 years, or 7 years. That you should focus on the mother tongue. I just want to know how important is it. I was reminded when you mentioned about the Dutch.
Right. Well, I have a lot to say about that, and I certainly talk about this in my book. And when I grew up in the late 60s in the United States, the real pressure was to learn English and to speak English. And so my parents are from Kerala, and they spoke Malayalam to my sister and I growing up, but they never insisted on us speaking back. They just assumed that we would pick it up. And again, like I said, the predominant thought at the time was you just need to speak English well, you want to assimilate. And I have to say, probably my biggest regret is that I speak Malayalam like a child because I never really was forced to speak back. And also, at that time, of course, there was a lot less folks that also were speaking Malayalam around us. And so as a parent, I've actually really tried to encourage my kids to speak other languages and certainly to speak, again, their mother tongue. I don't actually speak Malayalam to them, but my husband is German. So it's very important in our household that he is the one that speaks German to them all the time and that they respond back. And certainly that we're working on also writing in every place that we've lived in. They've also gotten extra kind of support in terms of the German language, because I think it's really important in terms of, again, kids having some sense of connecting with their mother community and that home language, and not being like me, where when I come back to India, sometimes they're like, but you look Indian, but how come you're not speaking Malayalam very well and you're not speaking Hindi very well? Like, what happened here? And so again, to your point, as much as we can encourage kids at young ages to speak and to speak back in these languages, and also to have that writing ability, I think it's important. And if we can do this by the time that they're 12 or 13, it's a lot easier than when they become adults. So trying to do this, at some point you make choices. My kids have learned probably 4 or 5 languages over the time that we've lived in different places. So you sometimes start to make choices about what languages you want to hold on to. But as much as we can give that child the ability to pick up languages and use them, I think it's such a great skill for them to have.
Now, the last question we're going to take from Prajakta, she would like me to read it. Her tween son is always so angry, but he doesn't know what makes him angry and why. How do you address that?
Well,
With that, I will say, of course, your closing thoughts, and thank everyone, because that's such an important question. Because I also see this, the teenagers are just angry.
right. Well, as I mentioned before, just a very normal part of adolescence is going through all of these changes, and that there's tremendous changes that are happening in terms of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is making connections. It's helping one to think about logical thought and organization, and those are not fully there until late in adolescence. So coming back to a child that's always angry, just remember that hormones have a lot to do with moods and with changes. And certainly there's a huge fluctuation, and most kids themselves don't even know why this is happening. It's really hard for them. So coming back and saying, I listened to this talk today, and this pediatrician said a lot of what you're going through is actually quite normal. It's not always easy for us as parents to understand or support you, but we are there for you. One of the best articles I ever read was that kids just want us to be like plants, like house plants, just to be there, be quiet, be in the room, but be supportive. And so I just remind you of that when your child is becoming very angry and irritable. They are going through a normal developmental process. They're not doing this because they're mad at you. They're just doing this because of what the changes are. Don't take this personally. Take, again, this advice that they want you, though. They want you to be supportive. If you can, as much as possible, be there, love them, give them that love and attention that they need, but try not to react too much. And the other book I love is what I call duct tape parenting, that we should all be putting some tape on our mouth and saying less. Those are 2 images I give you to get you through this period. It will get better, I promise you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Anisha. Any last words before we sign off for the evening?
Well, thank you again for this opportunity to speak. I will just say that if for anyone that's interested in my book, it is available on Amazon India. I certainly think that there's some very good tips. And in fact, each chapter starts with the questions that young people have asked me, and also questions that parents have asked me on different topics, and ends with those answers. So if nothing else, you can very quickly kind of get some quick ideas of how to answer some of these big issues. I have a website, dranishaAbraham.com. If anyone would like to contact me after, have more questions, they certainly can through my website. I write a monthly newsletter called Global Teens. I'm on Instagram. So there's different ways to connect with me. But coming back to the point that we made at the very beginning, the biggest reason that I wrote this book, and certainly something that I think about a lot as a pediatrician, is how we can improve our relationships with teens and parents, and this idea of conversations and connections. So I hope all of you that are attending this will come back to your own households and think about one issue that we've discussed today, and having a conversation with their teenager, and trying to build on that rapport and build on those connections that you have. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. I know it's an early morning for you, and now you have to go to work. So with that, we will be signing off, and thank you all for joining us for today, and have a very, very good evening.
Thank you.